Good morning, welcome back. Today is October 24th, and because it is cold and wet outside, I am in here where it is dry and warm. When it comes right down to it, I am only so dedicated to the bit about being on the deck. So I'm inside today. Perhaps next week, if it warms up or at least dries up, I can be outside long enough, when it's cold, but not when it's wet. So let's talk about this date, October 24th, things that happened. First of all, it was on this date in 1881 that construction of the Statue of Liberty began in New York Harbor that gift from France. There's actually a smaller, I think it's the model that on which the larger Statue of Liberty was built, is actually in the Seine River in Paris. So if you ever go to Paris, look for that on the Seine River. Speaking of rivers, it was on this date in 1901 that Anna Taylor was the first woman to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. Now this was something she did intentionally. That was really quite the thing there for a while, and Anna Taylor was the first woman to do that. So I guess hurrah, yay for women's rights there. 1926, speaking of stunts, in 1926, today is the date of Harry Houdini's last performance. The famous magician Harry Houdini's last performance took place at the Garrick Theater in Detroit. Now, I don't know if it was just after this particular performance or sometime later. That's when the story goes, he was reading his mail and a kid, like a college-age kid, said, "Can I punch you?" And Houdini says, "Sure." So the kid up and punches him. Houdini's not ready, contracts appendicitis, which leads to peritonitis, and he ends up dying. If you're really interested in Harry Houdini, there are several books about him, but he also made several films showing some of his acts, and so you can check them out on YouTube if you're interested in seeing actual footage of Harry Houdini doing his thing. Today in 1929, it's Black Thursday. That is, it's the day that the stock market began to fall. And then that actually just got worse as the week went on. But it began on this day. Today is Black Thursday. Now, this is not to be confused with the day the stock market fell in 2008. That's called Bloody Friday. So again, if you're a historian of the stock market, you want to keep track of, don't confuse your Black Thursdays with your Bloody Fridays. Okay, so there's a tip for you there. 1931, Al Capone was sentenced to 11 years in jail for tax evasion. It was just in the newspaper yesterday or earlier this week, I should say, that there was an auction of Al Capone memorabilia, including things like his favorite gun. And it sold for something like $500,000. So even still, 80 years later, 90 years later, Capone's image and memory is still a big deal, certainly here in the Chicago area, if not in the entire United States. In 1954, President Dwight David Eisenhower, Ike, as we like to call him, pledged support to the South Vietnamese government. Now, this was sometime after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which was where the North Vietnamese army had defeated the French. So the French were fighting in Indochina, as it was called. And then after the defeat at Dien Bien Phu, they left, and suddenly South Vietnam was worried. And Eisenhower in 54 said, "Oh, no, don't worry, we'll support you." And then the next thing you know, there's men, material, and 500,000 soldiers and personnel, U.S. personnel, lost their lives there in Vietnam over the next, 15, 20 years. 2 years later, in 1956, the Soviet Union invades Hungary, part of this Iron Curtain coming down across Eastern Europe. And if you're interested, there's a real interesting book. This is my copy, called The Bridget Ann Dow. It's by James Michener, who went on to write other books, Alaska and others, The Source. But he wrote this book about the Hungarian invasion. In fact, it says here, the heroic story of the revolt by the Hungarian people that made crystal clear to the world the true face of communism. Now, might be an interesting read. So, let's see. In 1989, televangelist James Baker was sentenced to jail, 45 years in prison. Kind of interesting, the same day that Al Capone was sentenced to jail, for fraud, and it was later reduced to 8 years. So he went to jail on this date in 1989. Well, he was sentenced. I think he was already in jail, but he was sentenced to 45 years, later reduced to 8. Jim Bakker, still with us, still on TV, not quite the audience that he used to have. Every once in a while, you'll hear something about him. As I understand it, he's big into coronavirus cures and millennial or end of the world apocalyptic sort of stuff. And there's also a new movie, I have not seen it, about Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker, where Hollywood decides to treat Tammy Faye Bakker nicely, which is just the opposite of everything they did while she was alive, which kind of annoys me, but that's just my opinion. You know, she was the butt of everybody's jokes all the time she was alive. And now suddenly we've decided that she was an icon of some sort. But, you know, kind of Hollywood, make up your mind. It's really what I'm saying there. And it was on this date in 2003 that the Concorde, the SST supersonic transport plane, made its last commercial flight. There were a couple of crashes of the Concorde, and so they decided that even though there were fewer crashes of the Concorde than there were of other planes, like a 737 or whatever, but there were far fewer flights. So statistically, you were far more likely to crash in a Concorde than you were, say, in a 747 or whatever airplane you were. And so they ceased doing commercial flight operations. Now they still have the planes and they still use them, but they don't carry passengers anymore. Although there is some talk of trying to revive the Concorde in some way. Not a lot of birthdays that I wanted to note today, but it is on this date in 1852 that U.S. Congressman Daniel Webster died. Daniel Webster, probably best known to most of us as being the protagonist of the story, The Devil and Daniel Webster. Very famous congressman, orator, speechmaker, died on this date in 1852. And of course, The Devil and Daniel Webster was actually turned into a Simpson episode, which, you know, to me is like, how do you know it's really great literature? Well, it was turned into a Simpson episode. But he died on this date in 1852. Some 120 years later, in 1972, Jackie Robinson, good old number 42 of the Brooklyn Dodgers, died. Now, he was only 53 years old, but he died on this date in 1972. The man who broke the color barrier back in the 1950s or like 1940s. Died 1972. And then finally in 2005, Rosa Parks died. The woman who helped instigate the Montgomery bus boycott back in the 1950s, civil rights pioneer, leader, died on this date in 2005. If you ever had the chance to go to the Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati, I highly recommend it. But they have a thing there where you sit on this bench that looks like a bus bench, and you have a virtual reality, I don't know, goggles or whatever, and you put those on, and you actually can recreate that experience. You can be sitting in the seat, and you see the person walk up to you and say, "You need to get out of the seat," and all that. So it's kind of an interesting experience. I mean, the whole thing is well worth your time. It's in Cincinnati. So I highly recommend it here. So let's get back to Isaiah. Today we're going to talk about the last of the servant songs. Most of the time we refer to this as just Isaiah 53. It's actually much more than that, or somewhat more than that. But we'll talk about its significance. And pretty much that's about all we're going to cover today. So this may be short. I don't know. But let's get back to that. Good morning. Welcome back. We're here to talk about what is probably, at least within the Christian tradition, the best known passage in all of Isaiah. It's the fourth servant song. Now let's talk real quick about what we've been saying here. Isaiah 1 through 39 is Isaiah's prophecies to the nation of Israel, okay, and the nation of Judah. Okay, Judah, Israel, the situation that they find themselves in, and what God is going to do to them, for them, on their behalf, so to speak. Okay. Then Isaiah, starting with Isaiah 40, going through somewhere around Isaiah 55, we said that the emphasis and the direction or the focus changes to the nation in captivity. Okay, and these are messages given to a nation under judgment, and interspersed in these nations in these chapters, these 15 or so chapters, you have 4 servant songs. And so you have Isaiah the prophet talking to the nation, and God talking to the nation, explaining here's why you got where you are, and then giving these servant songs where they sing a song, it's a poem about how they're going to be brought out of this. Okay, and so each of the servant songs, we've talked about 3 of them, and now today we're going to talk about the 4th servant song. Okay, and the 4th servant song in Isaiah goes from Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12. Okay, through the end of chapter 53, and this leads into one of my little pet peeves about our current approach to the Bible, and that's this: we often talk about Isaiah 53 as being this great passage, and it is. Don't get me wrong. And when we talk about it, we start reading the passage at verse 1, who is believed or reported to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed. Okay, as if that's the beginning of the thought, and it's not. Okay, chapters, if I've said this once, I've said it a bazillion times, chapters and verses are not inspired. Okay, sometimes they're arbitrary. Sometimes they're in bad places. And this is one example. Okay, so Isaiah 53:1 comes in the middle of the 4th servant song. Okay, so again, we're talking about the 4th servant song, Isaiah 52:13 through Isaiah 53:12. What we in the English, looking at the English text version, say that. Okay, now this 4th servant song is a very explicit description of the servant who is going to bring about this reconciliation, or what's going to happen to this servant. But more accurate to say, what is going to happen to this servant who is going to bring about the reconciliation that God has promised. Okay? And the big question when we get to the end is going to be identifying who this servant is. Okay? And we'll get to that in a minute. But I want to kind of walk through the text itself, just the verses, and kind of get an idea of what Isaiah is saying about this particular servant. Okay? So, beginning with verse 13. Isaiah 52:13. Okay, now let me say this first of all. 52:13 is a poem. Okay, it's a poem of 15 verses. It's 5 stanzas of 3 verses each. Now, we don't necessarily see this in the English. Okay, so you're just gonna have to trust me, just like I trust the Hebrew scholars who write the commentaries, that each of these stanzas or strophes have three verses each. And so there's 5 parts to this. Okay, so it's verses 13 through 15, 1 through 3, 4 through 6, 7 through 9, 10 through 12. Okay, each of those is one of the 5 stanzas, and we'll talk about those. And as you can see, getting back to my slightly earlier point, 53:1 is the start of the 2nd stanza of the poem. Okay, it would be like saying, what's your favorite hymn? And you throw out the hymn, let's sing it, and you start on the 2nd verse. And some people do that. Some people like the 2nd verse more than the 1st verse, but that's okay. But you get my point. Usually we start on the first thing, except when there's chapters and verses involved, then suddenly we have to start on verse 1. Regardless. All right, let's look at the first stanza. And the first stanza of this servant song is really talking about description of the servant. And you just see that this servant is astonishingly normal looking. Okay, normal in appearance, normal both physically and emotionally, socially, kind of normal. All right. So verse 13, behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. Okay, here, interesting, this particular phrase where it says, my servant will be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. Now, this phrase about high, lifted up, exalted is only used 4 times in the Old Testament. All 4 times are in Isaiah. The other 3 times that it's used in Isaiah, this passage, that phrase is used to mean God. It's referring to God the Creator. Okay. Now, that's just a point of comparison. It doesn't necessarily mean that this time it's referring to God the Creator, but it's not a stretch to say, well, if it meant it at the other 3 times, it does here too. Just keep that in mind as we move along. Behold, my servant shall act wisely; he shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted. Now, this is not the first time. Again, beginning with the servant songs, for example, in chapter 42, verse 1, Isaiah refers to my servant. Okay, let's look at that particular Isaiah. Let's see. Let's go back page 221 in my little thing. Chapter 42, verse 1. Behold, my servant who I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. Okay, so here we talk about this servant. This is why they call them the servant songs, because they're talking about this servant. And what is this servant going to do? And who is this servant? Okay, so I'll hold that. Let's move on. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand. Okay, so this is the start of this 4th servant song. Okay, and it's this is kind of beginning this description of what the servant is supposed to look at. Okay, or look like. And here in verse 14, as many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance. Okay, now this works on many different levels. Okay, this idea of, okay, what does it mean that his appearance was marred? It's not beyond human semblance. Okay, and I think the easiest explanation to look at this is say, okay, the appearance of the servant is not what people expected. Okay, so in other words, the person that's going to bring about this reconciliation between Israel and God doesn't appear like someone who is going to do this, or not what people would expect. Okay, so I think that's kind of one way to go with this. Okay, and I know some of you may be screaming, no, wait, what about? And stick with me till the end, and we'll see how it ends up. Okay. So he shall sprinkle many nations. Now the word there that the ESV translates sprinkle is a weird word. It's only used here in this passage, so they don't really know. That's the trouble when a Hebrew word is only used one time in the entire Old Testament. They don't have a lot of grounds, and it's not a cognate or something, and the context isn't clear. It's kind of difficult for them to do that. Although others, like I think the NIV, looks at that and thinks that the word should be translated startle. Okay, that his this servant's appearance or presence will startle people. Okay, and I think that's probably I like the NIV translation better. Not being a Hebrew scholar, I don't really know which one is the correct one, but it is a tricky one. For that which, end of verse 15, for that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand. Here it's kind of interesting that at some point these kings who are surprised by the appearance of the servant are suddenly going to understand things that they're going to realize that the light's going to go off. Oh, I see, I get it now. Okay, so this outwardly normal and then but not what you expect is kind of the first stanza. Okay, so the second stanza begins in verse 1 of chapter 53, and this is where we traditionally begin this, I should say wrongly traditionally begin our discussion of this particular passage. So again, anytime somebody wants to talk about Isaiah 53, if they start up on this passage and they start at verse 1, they're starting at the wrong point. You can quote me on that. You can just say, hey, listen, Stan on October 24th said that's the wrong place to start. You should start 3 verses back. But that's free. Who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Okay, who has believed? And again, if you're, my King James sneaking up on me, who has believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? Kind of thing. All right, who's going to believe this? no one's going to believe this. No one believed this. And who was it that saw the arm of the Lord? Now, we've talked about this image of the arm of the Lord, this readiness to judge, or this readiness to bring about his will. Okay, so it isn't always necessarily a judgment element. It's just the Lord's ability, God's ability to bring about his desires, okay, to make his will happen. Sometimes that involves punishment. Sometimes that involves destruction. Sometimes that involves sending an angel to push a donkey one way or the other, in the case of Balaam. Okay, so it's just, that's kind of what, when people talk about in the Old Testament, they talk about the arm of the Lord. Okay, most of the time it's talking about some sort of a judgment, but not always. It's basically just the ability of the Lord to bring about his desires. Okay, but again, this second stanza, verses 1 through 3, kind of talks about a hasty dismissal. That, again, we talked in the first stanza is like normal, but not necessarily recognized. And stanza 2, verses 1 through 3, talks about this hasty dismissal. So who's believed it? Nobody's believed this. Okay, verse 2. For he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of a dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should despise him. I'm sorry, that we should desire him. Okay, the servant doesn't look the part. Okay, so, it's kind of interesting because earlier in Isaiah 3, I want to say it is, remember we had the story about talking about the end times where they choose their leader because he had a nice coat. Okay, go back a little further when you're talking about in Samuel where they picked Saul. One of the things that they liked about Saul was he was tall and, very tall and just looked the part of a king. And so people say, hey, this guy looks like a king. He should be our king, which is very similar to picking a guy in the first part of Isaiah because he's got a nice coat, because he dresses well. Okay, but still, he's going to say, listen, there's nothing about this guy this servant is going to make you think, oh, that's what's bringing about God's will. He was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not. Okay, he was despised and we esteemed him not. Now, the verse here, the first word, he was despised and rejected of men. There's a connotation point here to make, and that is that the English phrase, you have this emotive element, this idea that, despised, rejected. Whereas the Hebrew word, the context or the implication has more to do with an indifference. Kind of like, oh, yeah, whatever, just sort of not even bothering to pay attention to it, okay? So it isn't that there was a serious contemplation and rejection, angry rejection, which is the way the English kind of implies. It was more of a, no, I'm not even going to waste my time with you. He was rejected of men. A man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised. And we, that is the nation of Israel, esteemed him not. We didn't recognize him for who he is, whoever this servant is. Now, verse 3, it stanza 3, beginning in verse 4 through 6, we have this idea or this the concept where you're there, Israel, you're in captivity because of your sin. It's your fault. Okay? This is very similar in Daniel chapter 9, where Daniel is reading Jeremiah, and he kind of looks and he realizes, hey, we're here because of our own fault. We're here because of our own sin. All right, so that's something to think about here. Verse 4, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Okay, whose griefs? Our griefs. He's carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. We looked at him and go, God's judging. So, we had the chance. He was there. We saw him, but we didn't. We just figured God was punishing him and didn't mess with him. Okay, this couldn't be our fault. Okay. Now, here's the interesting question. In Isaiah 40, verses... No, you know what? I'm going to hold on to that thought for a minute here. Let me make a note here, because I just realized that comes back better somewhere else. He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. Okay, now this is kind of, going to be really weird sounding. And whose wounds? Well, verse 6, all we like sheep have gone astray. So this is kind of the Old Testament counterpart to Romans 3:23, for all have sinned. Okay, so all we like sheep have gone astray. Okay, all of us. Right? All of us have gone astray. Not those guys, but not me. Not you people, but not my people, or that people group, but not my people group. Okay, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Now, this has an element of the substitutionary concept to it, which is something that the Jewish believers or Jewish writers and readers would have understood. The whole idea of the sacrifice coming in and taking on the sin of the persons giving the sacrifice. So they would have understood this as a substitutionary element. Okay. Stanza 4 begins in verse 7. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Now, twice in this verse, we're starting stanza 4 here. And stanza 4 is talking about just being unjustly punished. Okay, unjustly punished. All right. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Twice in this verse it says he didn't open his mouth. He didn't complain about this. He didn't talk about this. All right. Why? Okay. Interestingly, and I'm not going to answer that question, or I can't answer that question yet. But here, when he talks about he like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, many look at this verse and think that's what John in John 1:29 is referring to when he says, "Look, the Lamb of God." When he sees Jesus and Lamb of God, he's referring back to this in John chapter 1, from John chapter 1. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Now, this could mean one of two things. There's no deceit in his mouth. It could be referring back to the fact that within the passage that no complaint was made. Or it could just be talking about a sinful nature, no sin in his existence. Or, so three things. It could mean that at this point in the judgment, and you'll see why this is significant when we get to the end here, that the whatever deceit was there has been worked out, burned out, removed, kind of thing. Verse 10 talks about God's will, just pointing out that this was all part of God's plan. As weird as all of this sounds, this is part of God's plan. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Okay. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Again, repeating that substitutionary element to it. Okay. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. Okay. So this servant here is going to, this servant that is going to bring about this reconciliation has a lot of things going for him. Okay. And here at the end it says he bear their iniquities, and he bears the sins of many, okay, and makes intercession for the transgressors. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on. Okay, now this is a very well-known passage, and I'm sure, especially, there's things from the Messiah and others that are quoted out of this passage in the New Testament. But before I get to that point, I want to ask the question, and I've slipped a couple of times because, I'm coming obviously from a New Testament Christian believer perspective, okay? But we need to ask ourselves the question, who is the servant? Okay, who is this servant talking about? All right, now I'm doing it this way because I want to go back to the start of the passage and look at the three possibilities of who this servant is, okay? Now, the overwhelming belief amongst Jewish practitioners, let's call it Jewish practitioners, people who are in Judaism, Orthodox Jews, conservative, all that, is that Isaiah 53, along with the rest of Isaiah, the whole book of Isaiah, is talking about the nation of Israel. Okay? And so that the servant referenced in Isaiah 53, 52:13 through 50, in this fourth servant song, is referring to the nation of Israel. And previously in Isaiah, the phrase, my servant, does refer to Israel. So this is just consistent with the other passages in the Old Testament. Okay, now let's look at that and think about it. Okay, servant Israel. Now let's look at this passage with that in mind, that context in mind, and see how it fits. All right, my servant, he shall be high and lifted up. Now, how many times in this book do we hear about the city of Jerusalem being high and lifted up and people coming up to it? There you go, high and lifted up. That's the nation of Israel, okay? His appearance was so marred beyond human semblance. Okay, what does the nation of Israel look like now? Okay, at the point of the reading, okay, it looks like a pile of rubble, marred beyond recognition, okay? Kings shall shut their mouth from that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand, that when Israel is brought back, it will become clear to these kings that God has reconciled with Israel. It doesn't explain how Israel is doing the reconciling, but, okay. Who has believed it? What he's heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Nobody's going to believe that Israel is the servant, and yet that's what's going to happen. For he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of a dry ground. Started from a very small seed, started from a very small plant. Okay, go back where God says, go back to Abram. Out of one I made many. Okay, so Abram is the founder of of the Israel of the day, the nation of Israel, the people group of Israel. Started with a very small and grew into this great thing. Okay, he was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. So this humanizing of the nation of Israel, saying, listen, how are people treating Israel right now? Okay, are they acquainted with grief? Well, yeah, they just had their whole nation taken out from them. Okay, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. So what did the people reading this, those in captivity, think of the nation of Israel, or God's chosen people of Israel? Well, we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Okay, see, it fits. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Why was the nation crushed? Because of our transgressions. Again, it's your fault that you're there. Okay? All we like sheep have gone astray. Again, all of the individual members of the nation of Israel are responsible. Again, a collective idea, interesting thought. Transfer that to a lot of different areas. But we're in this situation because of all of us, and the nation suffered as a result. Okay, the Lord has laid on him, the nation of Israel, the afflicted of all. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Okay, now this is a little tenuous because, again, you go through Psalms and you hear it's like Israel is nonstop complaining, it seems. But opened not his mouth, what could they do? Assyria wasn't going to stop them because they were feeling abused. And again, going back to verse 9, and they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death. So again, this destruction of Israel brought the remnant, the broken, where? To the rich nation. See how that works? Okay. Verse 10, getting into stanza 5, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. Okay. Yeah, we've talked about this over and over again. The Lord is saying, listen, this punishment is being brought about so that, okay, the punishment itself isn't the it isn't the point. It's the restoration that's the point, and it was God's will that this happen. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring, he shall prolong his days. Okay? Remnant. This is that remnant that there's going to be a return. I'm going to prolong your days. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall be, and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous, my servant, make many to be acquainted righteous. So that there is a role in the future world, eschatological perhaps, or apocalyptic world for Israel. And again, this has been repeated over and over again. Okay, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many. Okay, this nation of Israel, all destroyed because of all of our sins. This collective guilt brought about this thing and makes intercession for the transgressors. So this is somehow appeasing God. This captivity they're in is appeasing God in such a way that at some point they're going to be able to come back. So you can see if you look through this fourth servant song that you can fit the nation of Israel and the people group of Israel into it. Okay, and it makes pretty good sense. Okay, and I say that because it isn't necessarily a good argument tool or a good what's the word I'm looking for? Way to prove your point. To say, well, look at Isaiah 53. How could you believe this is anything but? Somebody who is an Orthodox Jew who knows his or her Old Testament or their Bible, which is what we call the Old Testament, is going to go, no, that's talking about Israel, and here's why. Okay, so kind of understand that. Just make that clear. Okay, so there's a second. That's kind of the overwhelming view within the Jewish tradition, that it's talking about the nation of Israel. Now, there's a secondary view, and that is that this is just talking about Hezekiah. Okay? Hezekiah being a king, great king. Okay, again, we talked about Hezekiah before, 36 through 39. We met Hezekiah, kind of had some stories about him. And there are some who have looked back at this and kind of in what is referred to in Bible interpretation as a hyperpreterite view, and that is to say that whatever he is talking about here has already occurred and is already completed in the past at a particular point in time. And this is all talking about Hezekiah. Okay, and we're talking about Hezekiah as his servant, and Hezekiah is referred to as God's servant. Act wisely, he's highly lifted up. He certainly is. He's made the king. Okay, he startles many nations, several things, and then he gets sick. And the big point here is his sickness, and we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Why? This is that sickness that Hezekiah has. He was despised and rejected of men. Okay, again, the Rabshakeh was making fun of Hezekiah, and all these people didn't like Hezekiah. Okay, and with his wounds we are healed. Again, it's kind of stretching it with Hezekiah, but all of these things happened, and the whole idea of his opening not his mouth is problematic because it's his praying to, again, this is the minority view, but he's praying to God. That's hardly not opening your mouth. But it was there. God had a lesson to teach him. It was the will of the Lord to crush him. When his soul makes an offering, he shall see his offspring. So he makes an offering, he shall see his offspring. So what happens to Hezekiah? Hezekiah is granted a reprieve. He's told he's going to die. He said, no, you're not going to die. You're going to live 15 more years. And then 3 years later, he has a son. So his days are prolonged. He sees his son, okay, Manasseh, who turns out to be a rotten king. But that's a whole other story. Okay, so in that sense, that fits Hezekiah. So there's a minority view that looks at Isaiah 53 and says this is Hezekiah. Okay, so again, it isn't a slam dunk to just walk up to somebody who's a Jewish believer and argue a Christological interpretation of Isaiah 53, or this fourth servant song. And we're going to talk about the Christological interpretation here in just a second. Okay, because again, they've studied this as well, probably more than any of us have, and they're going to say, no, that's talking about Isaiah, or I'm sorry, that's talking about Israel. That's talking about the nation of Israel, consistent with the rest of the book. Okay, and this is why it's important to look at the book in any passage within the context of the entire book. All right. Now, the third way to look at this, and this is traditionally what those of us from a Christian tradition would say, is looking at Isaiah 53, this fourth servant song. See, I keep going back to Isaiah 53. Okay. Again, I'm making that just so ingrained in this. We look at this fourth servant song and we say, well, obviously that's talking about Jesus. Clearly that's talking about Jesus. And it fits on a number of levels, because it's like, who is going to bring about this ultimate reconciliation of the nation of Israel with God? Well, it's the work of Christ on the cross. Okay. Now we've got further evidence that this is an accurate representation based on New Testament use of the passage. Okay. So I've repeated this point over and over again, that if you see a passage in the Old Testament and you don't want to go just saying, oh, this is Jesus, if there isn't a New Testament element saying it is. Okay. Because you could end up overly interpreting, kind of putting too much Jesus in the Old Testament. I know that sounds heretical, but the Old Testament has its purpose, and not every passage is Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Okay, so, but Isaiah, this fourth service song, Isaiah 52:12 through 53, is mentioned or referenced 16 times, according to the Zondervan Encyclopedia of the Bible. It's referenced 16 times in the New Testament, always referring to Jesus. Okay, and the things that Jesus did on the cross. Okay, so for example, I'll give the most obvious example is in Acts chapter 26. Okay, and I'm just going to open here in Acts chapter 20. I'm sorry, that's not right. Acts chapter 8, verse 26. So in Acts chapter 8, verse 26, the New Testament church is just kind of getting off the ground, right? You've got Pentecost happens in Acts chapter 2, and then Acts chapter 5, you've got Ananias and Sapphira, and you've got in Acts, there's persecution coming. Stephen is stoned and has been killed, so you've had your first persecution in the area. And in Acts chapter 8, you have the story of Philip, one of the deacons, who is sent into the Arabian desert. So in Acts chapter 8, beginning with verse 26. Okay, now I'm reading from the original NIV. Okay, not the updated, but this is the original NIV. Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, go south to the road, the desert road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. So he started out, and on the way he met an Ethiopian eunuch, an important official in charge of all the treasury of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. This man had gone to Jerusalem to worship. Okay, now he would be considered either a Jewish proselyte, that is somebody who was not a native Jew but had converted to Judaism, or a God-fearer, somebody who respected it and perhaps was on his or her way to becoming a proselyte, but had not necessarily crossed the line at that point. But here, bless his heart, he's studying the Word, right? He said, Philip ran up to the chariot and heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet, just like we are. And he says, do you understand what you are reading? Philip said. How can I? He said, unless someone explains it to me. So he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. The eunuch was reading this passage of Scripture. He was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before the shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. And in his humiliation he was deprived of justice. Who can speak of his descendants? For his life was taken from the earth. Quoting from Isaiah 53, 7 and 8. The eunuch asked him, tell me, please, who is the prophet talking about, himself or someone else? Okay, now, a question. Is Isaiah talking about himself, Isaiah? Or is there somebody else, some other individual? Now, it's interesting that the eunuch looks at this and says, that's an individual. Then Philip began with that very passage of Scripture and told him the good news about Jesus. So Philip takes this particular passage and says that's talking about Jesus, and expands on that and is able to witness to this Ethiopian eunuch. Other passages, for example, in, 1 Peter, again with the Hebrews, James, 1 Peter. In 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning with verse 21, Peter says, to this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. And then he quotes from Isaiah, he committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. Okay, so that passage referring to Jesus. Okay, and there's another passage in Matthew, in Matthew chapter 8. Let me just look at this real quick. Matthew chapter 8, verse 17. Matthew 8:17. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits. Okay, Matthew's talking about Jesus. Okay, this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and carried our diseases. So Matthew, obviously and clearly writing after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, is looking back on something that Jesus did and said, oh, that is fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah 53. Okay, so the third thing to remember, or another thing to remember, is this, as far as whether it's Israel or not. Okay, in Isaiah chapter 40, we mentioned, let me go back to that particular passage. In Isaiah chapter 40, as we started this passage, or this section of Isaiah, we said, comfort, comfort my people, speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and cry to her that her warfare is ended, her iniquity is pardoned, that she has received from the Lord hands double for all her sin. And we talked about that passage, and we said that indicates that at this point, God is done with Israel. There is no more judgment. Yet here, in Isaiah, in the fourth servant song, we see that there is judgment to come. Okay, so if it is Israel that's to be judged even more, then Isaiah 40 can't be talking about being done. And you get in this weird thing. But if Isaiah 53, 52:12 through 53:12, or 52:13 through 53:12, is talking about someone else, the servant, then there is a substitutionary element. Okay, and those of us who are from the Christian tradition look at this and say, oh, this clearly is talking about Jesus. And we can go back and we can look at these passages. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up. Philippians 2, God also hath highly exalted him and given him a name that is above every name. Many were astonished. His appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, talking about the appearance. Again, there's 16 references that in the New Testament go back to this. His appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. Okay, talking about the appearance of Jesus on the cross. He grew up before him like a young plant. He grew up, Jesus came as a baby in the manger. Okay, so like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. So there was nothing within the appearance of Jesus that would make someone say, whoa, that guy's going to be the Messiah. Okay, one of the arguments, suppositions, I should say, is that why they needed Judas to betray Jesus is because they needed to have Judas to identify which one Jesus was. That Jesus looked just like all the rest of the Jews. Now, I know in any picture you see, now again, there were no cameras at the time, but in any painting, Jesus is always standing separately and very clearly. He's taller, better looking, hair combed kind of thing. And everyone else is kind of, looking not quite as elegant. Okay. Whereas in fact, I think Jesus looked pretty much like every other Jew. Okay. He was despised and rejected by men. Clearly, if the world hates you, he hated me first. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. I mean, we can get into the whole substitutionary atonement of Christ. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Certainly, Paul develops this, talking about, the atonement and what did that all mean. Clearly talking about Jesus. All we like sheep have gone astray. I already mentioned that this is kind of the Old Testament equivalent to Romans 3:23. All we like sheep have gone astray. Okay. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Okay. That kind of gets into the story of, of Jesus' time on the cross, talking about the punishment that's going to happen. It was the will of the Lord to crush him, for he has put him to grief, that this was part of the plan. Okay. And then at the end of verse 12, yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. And of course that, goes on I believe in 1 John, where we talk about always making intercession. Christ is always making intercession. So if you're from the Christian tradition, which I am, you look at Isaiah 53 and you say, wow, this is a great description of the work of Christ in bringing about that reconciliation. And the question then becomes, have you, as a Christ follower, Christ believer, have you taken advantage of that particular reconciliation yourself? All right, I'm going to leave you with that today. And next week, we're going to get back into Isaiah 54, and we're going to finish up this second middle section, and then we're going to get into the final section of the book of Isaiah and see how quickly we can finish. So if you have any questions or anything, by all means, let me know. You can leave me a note, comment in the YouTube, on the Facebook. You can email me, stan_rea@yahoo.com. I'll be more than happy to, or pull me aside at church if you see me, because we're back from all of our trips and stuff. So pull me aside at church. I'll be more than happy to talk to you about it. So thank you very much, and I'll see you later.